Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for, oh, there we go. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight via Zoom. Tonight we have a meteorologist speaking to us who is an eclipse chaser. And as you know, we are right in the path of the eclipse that will be happening next April. And Joe will be speaking to us about that and his adventures tonight. So feel free, if you have questions during the program, to put them in the chat. We will have a Q&A at the end, and we will be recording this so you can watch it again. Thank you, Joe, for letting us do that. And without further ado, please take it away.
Well, thank you very, very much. And you are absolutely correct. All of you who are watching right now have the great fortune of being in the path of the upcoming total eclipse of the sun next April, April the 8th. And I say that with great fortune because I myself have traveled to 13, count them, 13 different eclipses all around the world. And scientists travel sometimes halfway around the world just to get into the path of the solar eclipse. And here, this one is coming to you. You don't have to move at all. You're going to be right smack in the middle of this great spectacle, a truly bucket list event. And I will tell you now, if you want to make a note mentally or write it down, that darkness is going to fall over your fair community at 3:20 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the second Monday in April, April the 8th, 2024. At 3:20, the shadow of the moon is going to descend upon your area. The skies will darken, and you will have a view of, weather conditions permitting, of course, a total eclipse of the sun. Totality for your area will last 3 minutes and 40 seconds. So for 220 seconds, you are going to be enveloped in the shadow of the moon and will be witness to this great and glorious event, a total eclipse of the sun. Now, this is a PowerPoint presentation, and I will warn you right now that there are, of course, I've done this already like a half a dozen times, but for this session tonight, my problem is, and by the way, if you haven't muted yourself, could you mute your microphone, because we don't want anybody, I don't want to hear anybody or any extraneous sounds while I'm talking, because it does throw me off a little bit. But I want to tell you right off the bat that 2 of my videos, for whatever reason, are not working all of a sudden in my PowerPoint program. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, my PowerPoint screen, but when it comes time to show the video, I'm going to try to unshare, and that may take a little bit of doing, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to show you both of those videos in my presentation. So let me get the screen up and share that screen. And we'll do so here. And the topic is, of course, Adventures of an Eclipse Chaser. And my name, by the way, is Joe Rao. And when I'm all done, in about an hour or so, I'll be very happy. You can then unmute yourself, and I'll answer or try to answer any questions that you may have about the upcoming great celestial event. And it is a great celestial event. Who among us would not be impressed by the process and spectacle of a total solar eclipse? No spectacle that nature has to offer can rival a total eclipse of the sun for sheer drama and excitement. It's not just something that's seen. It's something that those of you who have been to eclipses have come to realize it's an experience. Every fiber of you becomes involved during those few precious moments of totality. And of course, at the beginning and the end, we have those remarkably beautiful diamond ring effects that grace our skies. They are indelibly implanted into our memories, and they remain a lifetime once we have been there where the shadow of the moon strikes the earth. Now, as I said, I have been to 13 solar eclipses all around the world. My most recent expedition was in December of 2021. of all places, and this shows you how sometimes you can really go out of your way to try to see one of these. I saw this from Antarctica, and you can see me in this image standing next to my very best friend. And she is my very best friend, in spite of the fact that on September the 1st, the two of us will be married 39 years. That's my wife, Renata, who has accompanied me on many of these solar eclipse ventures. So I've been to Antarctica. In 1999, in August of 1999, I saw a total eclipse of the sun just after sunrise. By the way, from time to time, I'll pause because I'll be moistening my throat here with a little bit of Poland spring water, which I'm doing right now. This particular eclipse that you see here was viewed from a cruise ship, a whale watching cruise, actually, off the coast of Nova Scotia in August of 1999. I saw this eclipse even though the weather prospects were not too good. Usually it's foggy and cloudy off of Nova Scotia early in the mornings in August. But I was on this ship, and as you can see, we got a clear view of the beautiful sight, the Diamond Ring. This eclipse lasted 50 seconds. Most people went to Europe because they said, oh, it's going to last so much longer in Europe. It's going to be high in the sky and the weather is so much better. Well, people went to the United Kingdom, cloudy. People went to France, cloudy. People went to Germany, rain. And yet here on this cruise ship, we had this perfect view of totality. I've also seen eclipses from the air. You'll see a few of those examples in just a very few moments. This picture was taken from the cockpit of an Air Berlin flight. We flew up to the polar regions, and on the left you can see Captain Heinz. He was the one who piloted this flight, and we had a great view of totality from about 40,000 feet. But before I talk about my expeditions, I thought I'd mention something about an astronomer from over 150 years ago, Professor Charles Young, who in the year 1869 had made very, very long preparations for viewing a total eclipse of the sun. He was planning to observe the flash spectrum. That's a phenomenon where when the sun is just covered completely, the spectrum of the sun changes, it reverses. Bright lines become dark, dark lines become bright. And this is only visible for a few seconds at most, both at the very beginning of totality and at the very end. So here you see Professor Young, and he certainly looks very distinguished, doesn't he? He certainly looks like the way an astronomer would look in the 19th century. So here he is prepared for months for this great event, and now the day has arrived, and now it's getting darker. The sun is getting whittled down to a crescent, and then finally the crescent disappears and the flash spectrum comes out. And his assistant, his associate, looking up into the sky, holding the lantern with one hand and then looking up into the sky, and he's holding the lantern because Professor Young is looking at the spectra and he's making notes. But his assistant, Professor Harkness, he's looking up at the sky at the eclipsed sun, and he says, "Oh my God, look at that!" Well, Professor Young said, "I looked over my shoulder for just an instant and beheld the most beautiful and impressive spectacle upon which my eyes rested. It could not have been more than 5 seconds, but the effect was so overwhelming as to drive away all certain recollections of what I had just seen. I cannot describe the sensation of surprise and mortification and imbecility and wasted opportunity that overwhelmed me when the sunlight flashed out." In other words, all of that waiting and rehearsing and looking for that moment of totality and that flash spectrum disappeared. All of what he had just seen went totally out of his head when he looked up into the sky and saw for himself the glory and wonder of a total solar eclipse. I don't know where Professor Young is now in this part of the universe, maybe somewhere up there, but wherever he is, let me say, if he can hear me now, he is not the first, and he certainly was not the last to come under the spell of a total solar eclipse. And here you see the person who's speaking to you now at the age of just almost 7 years old. And this is the story of when I first got hooked on eclipses. This was 60 years ago in July of 1963. And my grandfather that day walked into our kitchen and came up to me and said, as I was eating my breakfast, "Later today, we're going to have an eclipse." Well, of course, I was only 7 or didn't know exactly what he was talking about. I said, "What's an eclipse?" And immediately he took down from the kitchen shelf the salt shaker, the pepper shaker, and made a fist. And I had my first lesson in celestial mechanics. The fist, he said, represents the sun. The salt shaker represents the moon. The pepper shaker represents the earth. And later today, the salt shaker, or in this case, the moon, is going to come in between us and the sun, blocking out the sun and causing an eclipse. And that eclipse was a big event that day, that summer Saturday afternoon in July of 1963. Kids, as you can see here, running around, getting boxes, making projectors. They pierced a hole through the box. Some of them had their telescopes ready. Other people used dark film to look up at the sky, to safely look at the sun through dark exposed black and white negatives. And what they saw, of course, was the sun, but they also saw taken out of the sun what appeared to be a bite, and that was the moon moving in on the sun. Now, from where I was in the Bronx, skies were mostly cloudy, and it was kind of disappointing. I couldn't see very much of the eclipse at all. But then at 5:45 in the afternoon, as the eclipse was reaching its peak, lo and behold, the clouds began to thin and break, and through the clouds, without even needing use of the pinhole projector that I had made, or even the dark negative, there you see what I saw in the sky, a crescent sun. That from the Bronx, we didn't have a total eclipse. We had about 90% coverage, and it certainly was very interesting, either by projection through binoculars or looking up into the sky. It was an amazing sight, and I was blown away by this. I was taken aback by what I was seeing up in the sky. No longer was there a bright sun, but now there looked to be like a crescent moon up in the sky. This was the view again from the Bronx and from the tri-state New York metropolitan area. At dinner that night, I was so excited about what I had seen that I was, as my grandmother would say, a little chatterbox. And that's when my grandfather said, "You know, I made a mistake today. We should have gone to Maine." Because in the state of Maine, Maine was the only state in the United States that would be in the path of the total eclipse. Wherever you were within this dark band, which was roughly about 60 miles wide, you would see the sun completely covered by the moon and see one of nature's great spectacles, a total eclipse of the sun. Now, my grandfather knew that this was a spectacular sight because when he was 16 years old, back in January of 1925, he himself saw a total eclipse. This is the view, by the way, from Cadillac Mountain, the tallest peak along the Atlantic seaboard in Maine. And you can see the composite image of the sun moving into totality, the total eclipse, which lasted about a minute over Maine, and then the lingering effects as the moon moved off the sun's disk. But in 1925, in New York City, there was a total eclipse of the sun. And my grandfather remembered it. He watched it with his parents from along the East River Drive in Manhattan, and it was a glorious spectacle. As he later recounted to me as a 7-year-old, it was a great sight, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And that's why I made a mistake in not taking you to see that. I said, "Well, Grandpa, when are we going to have another chance? Well, will we have another chance to see a total eclipse? We'll go to see a total eclipse?" And he didn't know off the top of his head. And in fact, he thought it might be many, many, many years in the future. But then the next morning, he came into my room and said, "Make a date on your calendar, March 7th, 1970. Because on that day, the path of the moon's shadow would cross through Mexico, would go up across northern Florida and along the eastern seaboard. And yes, we would have a chance again to see at relatively close proximity a total eclipse of the sun. Look how close it came to New York and missed the New York area by 75 miles. But my grandfather had other plans. He told me when we see this eclipse, we'll go down to Florida. We'll go down, and that sounded real good to my grandparents. You know, a late winter vacation in Florida and a chance to show the grandson one of the great nature's great spectacles, a total solar eclipse. And in the years that followed, from 1963 to 1970, as we made it closer and closer to the year of the great eclipse, I got more and more interested in science, more and more interested in astronomy. I even entered and won the citywide science fair in New York that was sponsored by the New York Daily News in early 1970. And there you see yours truly in front of his science project. The project was all about the March 7th solar eclipse. One of the judges said that the reason why I won in the Bronx was not so much that I knew my stuff about the eclipses, but the story that I told, the passion that I was going to see very soon, my very first total eclipse of the sun with my grandfather. Unfortunately, and I'm sure many of you have realized this in your life, even though you may think that life is all planned out and written like a script, sometimes life does rewrites. In this particular case, the rewrite was in early in 1970, just a few months before the eclipse. My grandfather started speaking with a hoarseness in his throat. He went to his doctor. The doctor sent him to an eye, ear, and nose and throat specialist. They then went to St. Vincent's Hospital, and they found that my grandfather had cancer of the larynx, and he would have to have his voice box removed. If he didn't, he would die. So sadly, he had to have his vocal cords removed. Now, he did eventually learn how to speak again through a tiny hole in his throat called a stoma. He was able to bring up air through his diaphragm and belch out words. In fact, he got so good at it, he almost sounded like Popeye the Sailor when he talked to people. This was later on, long after the operation. But he was able to speak again. But unfortunately, this put a kink in the plans for seeing the total eclipse. In fact, the operation to remove his larynx was on March the 6th, the day before the big eclipse. So once again, no total eclipse for me. And this time, unlike 1963, where 90% of the sun was covered, this time in 1970, we had 96% of the sun covered. I took this picture in front of my house just before the eclipse began on that Saturday afternoon in 1970. And then when the eclipse reached its peak of 96%, this is what the sky and the landscape looked like. An eerie, almost dusk type twilight fell over the land because we had so much of the sun covered at the moment of it. But it wasn't a total eclipse. Still, it was just a partial eclipse, but still it was very eerie. Here's how the newspaper covered the story. Here you see what the sun looked like as the crescent pivoted around, and you could see how thin that crescent got, and then began to fatten up again after the maximum phase of the eclipse was over. After the eclipse, we went to visit my grandfather in the hospital. He had not yet been able to master speech, but he did have a little blackboard, a little slate. And so when I came into the room, and he knew I was disappointed in the event. I was just happy that he was alive and still with us. But he wrote on the blackboard, "When's the next one?" Now, he knew that I knew probably what the answer was because, again, in the 7 years while waiting for this eclipse, I had pretty much learned a lot in astronomy and science. And I knew when the next one was going to occur that was within range for us to see. That was going to be on July the 10th, 1972. That eclipse would sweep through Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, northern Alaska, across northern Canada, but then taking a sharp turn to the south and east, the path would then run across the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. And that's really not too far away from Maine, which is where he wanted to take me in 1963. And so I mentioned that to my grandfather. I said, well, there's one coming up in a couple of years in July of 1972, just a little ways to the north of Maine. And he quickly scribbled on the blackboard, we're going. That is a promise. And indeed, 2 years later, in July of 1972, we did indeed go to see that eclipse. Here you see the path of totality. Here you see Montreal. What we did was we traveled from New York, from the Bronx to Montreal in one day, a Saturday. And then on Sunday, we went from Montreal to Quebec City. That was about a 3-hour drive. And then we drove 5 hours on early Monday morning, the 10th of July, up along the St. Lawrence Seaway into the totality path to see this total solar eclipse that would occur that later on that afternoon. Right in the middle of the eclipse track was a place called Cap Chat, Quebec. And that is where I managed to find a hotel. There were a lot of hotels that were already booked solid. I did find a hotel, and I did get a room for us, for myself, my grandfather, my grandmother, my mom, and my sister. We all traveled in my grandfather's Plymouth Fury up to the total eclipse path. And here you see my grandparents. You see my grandfather there holding a dark piece of film looking up at the sky. And there you see my grandmother. My grandmother wasn't exactly too thrilled about this whole expedition. She couldn't understand why we were traveling 900 miles just to see it simply get dark for a couple of minutes. But she would soon learn all about total eclipses. It wasn't just so much that it got dark. And here you see a sequence taken not by me. This was taken by somebody who was to become a very, very close friend of mine. The person's name was Glenn Schneider, and Glenn was in Cap Chat as well. But unlike what we did, Glenn stayed in town in the city of Cap Chat. And Cap Chat, by the way, if you want to get an idea of what kind of a town it was, it pretty much reminds me today of the fictional town of Mayberry on the Andy Griffith Show, only everything was in French. that was the kind. And about the 2,000 people, the population of Cap Chat, 25,000 came to Cap Chat to see the total eclipse. And Glenn was one of them. As you could see, he took photographs of the gradual progression of the moon across the face of the sun. But notice, if you will, that as time wore on, clouds began to move in. And those clouds got progressively more widespread and thicker and more dense until finally, when we got to this point in the eclipse, can you see that? About 99% of the sun was covered. That was the last view that Glenn had of the sun, because then the clouds just completely rolled in, and Glenn completely lost the eclipse. He lost totality, couldn't see it because the skies had clouded over in his location. Now, what about me? I told you that I got a hotel room, but it was not exactly the greatest hotel room. Number one, to give you an idea, the closet was a nail on the wall. Number two, we learned that we would have to share the bathroom facilities with 5 other rooms on the same floor. This was the Hotel Minuet. And when my grandmother found out about this, she told my grandfather, Mario, we're not staying here. We're not going to stay at this hotel. So we had a little lunch at the hotel. Then we packed up our bags, checked out of the hotel, and then we moved out of Cap Chat. We actually were a few miles outside of the city. So while the city itself was clouded out, where we were located outside of the city limits, we had this view. In other words, the huge cloud that unfortunately killed the eclipse for my friend Glenn, for us, the sun moved out of the clouds just for a few moments during totality. And so we had an opportunity to see the total eclipse, and Glenn unfortunately got wiped out. Every time I bring up Cap Chat, Glenn says, don't mention that place. It still hurts all of these years later. And in fact, Glenn doesn't call that town Capshat. He has a completely different name, which this is a family show, so I'm not going to mention what he calls Capshat, but you can understand. He got clouded out, and I didn't. Now, Glenn and I didn't know each other at the time of this eclipse, July of 1972. But 6 months later, we did get to know each other because we both ended up volunteering on weekends at the Hall of Science in Flushing Meadow, Queens. By the way, here's yours truly, big smile on his face, having seen his very first total eclipse at the same age that my grandfather saw his first eclipse, at the age of 16. Now you see me next to my 4¼ inch reflecting telescope. What a great day that was, a day that my grandfather said, I'll bet you'll always remember this for the rest of your life. And certainly that has been the case. And as far as Glenn is concerned, as I said, the two of us ended up knowing each other first at the Hall of Science. We were volunteers at the planetarium that they had there. And with the passage of time, Glenn and I got to be really close, and we got to realize that the two of us were very much involved with the science and subject of eclipses. As far as Glenn was concerned, he was going to see every total eclipse that would occur on the Earth for the rest of his life. He made that mandate. As far as I was concerned, I said I'd be happy if I saw, more than a few, maybe 5, 6, 7. And of course, I said to this point in my life, I've already seen 13, and coming up in next April, hopefully, will be number 14. But we got to know each other very well, and we got to know that both of us immensely enjoyed the science and topic of eclipses. And Glenn and I had an idea. Actually, it was more Glenn's idea than mine. In the spring of 1977, he came up to me and he said, what do you think about this? The idea of the two of us leading a group of people to see the next total eclipse of the sun, which would be in South America. It would, in fact, go across the country of Colombia and would pass just to the north of the capital city of Bogota. Now, to me, I said, you think we could do something like that, Glenn? He says, oh, of course we can. We know all about the eclipses. We know about science. We certainly are old enough so that we can lead a group of people. And I said, well, if you think we can do that. And so we took out an ad in Sky and Telescope magazine. We were members at that time, and still am, of the local New York City Astronomy Club, the Amateur Observer Society. And the ad said that in collaboration with Design Travel Service, a local travel agency, that we would lead an eclipse, an exciting expedition to Colombia, South America, to observe the total solar eclipse on October 12th, 1977. And we actually got about 20 people to sign on to this from all over the United States, mostly the eastern United States, to come with us to see this total eclipse. Now, the demographic of the group that came was generally in their 40s and 50s. We even had a couple of women who were close to 80 years old. And I kind of wonder how they all felt when they met us for the first time to actually see who their leaders were. The two of us were 21 years old, and on the day of the eclipse, October the 12th, Glenn was going to turn 22. And again, if you're in your 40s or 50s, these are the people who are leading us through this foreign country to see this event. But that's how it all panned out. And here was our bus. Now, we learned a lot, Glenn and I, about leading a tour from this particular eclipse. And a lot of it wasn't good. This, for example, was our tour bus. And one of the things that I noticed when I got on the bus, I took a look at the dashboard and looked at the odometer. I can tell you that this bus was hardly new. And in fact, it broke down 300 or 400 yards after we got started on our trek to see the eclipse. And this was actually the first faint, feeble clarion call of the Greek chorus of tragedy about to make itself evident. But Glenn and I, like a couple of boobs, like Candide, we figured everything was going to be okay in spite of it. Along the way, we passed through several communities, several towns who were most interested in our tour and our hopes of seeing the eclipse. We mentioned the eclipse. They were certainly, the folks along the way were aware of what was going to happen during the course of that afternoon. Here am I with a piece of dark photographic film showing one of the natives how to use it and what to look for in the sky when the sun was going to begin to be covered by the moon in just a very few hours. It was about this time also that our bus driver, his name is Tomas, came up to Glenn and I and said, Senor, we told him where we wanted to go. He says, you know, I know a shortcut to get to where you want to go. And Glenn and I looked at each other and we looked back at Tomas and he said, a shortcut? He said, yes, I can get us there a lot quicker. And I said, you know, well, if that be the case, then why not, take the shortcut? We didn't know that Tomas hadn't been down this shortcut for a good 7 years, and things had changed a lot. Number one, it was an ungraded dirt road, a lot of bumps, a lot of potholes. And the other thing that we didn't realize was that along the way, as we were driving on this, again, mainly dirt road, was that we encountered a tropical shower. Now, I don't know, I'm sure many of you have been through a heavy downpour. This was probably one of the heaviest downpours. In fact, I even would call it a drownpour. And of course, we drive through this. And of course, on a dirt road, what eventually happens? The dirt turns to mud, and the mud got so thick that our bus got stuck. Yep, the bus got stuck in the mud. And so we had to actually ask our passengers, the people who were, who paid to be on this trip, to help push the bus out of the mud, which took a goodly amount of time. It was obvious that Tomas could not continue to go in the direction that he wanted to, so he had to turn the bus around, and we went back to one of the small towns where we had a chance to clean ourselves off as best we could. But now the eclipse was almost about to begin, and so we had to pick an alternative site. Where we were planning to go, the sun would be in totality for 55 seconds. But where we eventually ended up being or going, the sun would not be in totality for much more than 40 seconds. In fact, in listening to our tape recorders and looking at some of our films, it was actually 37 seconds of total eclipse. Not much of a totality. Still, we would be in the zone of total eclipse. One of our members of our tour group, Alden Wells, is pointing to the one lone patch of blue sky that was evident when the eclipse began. But believe it or not, the eclipse, as it progressed, the clouds rapidly began to clear until finally the sky was, I would have to say, 80 or 90% clear and blue and sunny. Here you see a picture of Glenn projecting the image of the sun onto a white screen here and pointing to a sunspot. And like 10 minutes before totality, under this beautifully clear or virtually beautifully clear sky, it looked like the eclipse was in the bag, so to speak. It looked like we were going to see it. But 5 minutes before totality, one single cloud began to encroach upon the sun, and like a slow-moving blimp, moved in front of the sun, blocking the sun out. And we couldn't move because there were hundreds of other people, eclipse watchers, who were on the road all around us. And so we couldn't, all get back on the bus and make a quick move down the road to get out of the way of the cloud. And so this is more or less what we saw during the total phase of the eclipse. A clouded out totality. The cloud up here colored by chromospheric red or pink. That's the chromosphere, the color of the edge of the sun as the sun is first moving into totality and moving out. I still remember hundreds of people, mostly talking in Spanish or Colombian, in exclamation like, and through this all, I heard one familiar voice. utter one single word as the sun began to become uncovered, and the realization was that we had missed out on seeing the total eclipse. And that voice was Glenn, and Glenn yelled, "Fertilizer!" Or a reasonable facsimile, if you will. What was even worse than that is that right after totality ended, the cloud moved on its way, the sun came out bright and clear, and then we saw something that we didn't expect to see, and that is the sun setting off on the distant horizon, backlit by, or in the foreground, you could see a radio tower, if you will, or some kind of a tower. But there, the sun partially eclipsed as it dropped down below the horizon. That would have been the icing on the cake if we had a chance to eat the cake. But unfortunately, the cake was totality, and we didn't get a chance to eat it or see it because of that one singular cloud cover. Well, after we got home, we took a couple of weeks to decompress, and then Glenn contacted me again, said, we can't let it go like this. We can't be defeated. We have to do better next time. And next time, the next eclipse would be in 1979, and this particular eclipse was known as Blackout 1979. And because of all of the things that happened to us in Colombia, we learned a lot, and we took that learning experience to heart and used that to make our next expedition a lot better. The next eclipse, February 26, 1979, started in the Pacific Ocean, the path of totality did, rolled into the Washington-Oregon coast, went across the Plain States, the Rockies, and then swept up into Canada. Where would we see this eclipse? Being a meteorologist, I did a study of the climatological odds of where the best view might be, and we chose a town by the name of Lewistown in the center of Big Sky Country, Montana. And more than a year in advance of the eclipse, we made up a news release, a press release, and we sent it out to all the newspapers in Montana, including the newspaper in Lewistown, the Lewistown News Argus, which of course made the front page of their newspaper. Eclipse viewers focus on Lewistown. Still remember getting a phone call from the editor of the newspaper after he had received the news release. The fellow's name was Dave Byerly, and he said, I just want to know one thing. This is not a joke, is it? It's true? And I said, yes, you are in the center of the path of the total eclipse. And we dubbed Lewistown, the eclipse capital of the world. And they took that to heart. Now, about weather. We got in contact with the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Montana, in Great Falls, Montana. Here you see a picture of myself and another member of our tour, and Dr. William Raymer, looking at the latest information, the latest data, and our chances of seeing the eclipse. He also stayed in touch with us. We got into Lewistown a few days before the eclipse, and as time wore on, the weather prospects, which started out looking rather grim, got better and better and better. And so we stayed in contact with the Great Falls Weather Service, and we also stayed in contact with the Lewistown Flight Service Station, which gave us up-to-date, up-to-the-minute weather forecasts on prospective cloud cover. Now, I would not become a TV weatherman in New York for, well, let's see, this is 1979. I would not get my first full-time job on television for another 16 years. Yet, on the local television station in Montana, in Great Falls, I made it on television talking about the weather conditions for the eclipse. The eclipse was a big story the day before the event in February of 1979, and here I am giving my forecast. I said that the weather looked reasonably good for viewing the eclipse, but then during the overnight hours, thanks to, again, reports from the Weather Service in Great Falls and also the local flight service station, it began to become evident that we we're going to be seeing clouds encroach upon our area at sunrise. The eclipse was a morning eclipse, and it would not reach total until about 9:30 a.m. And here you could see me giving the latest information to Glenn and his then girlfriend, Susan. And I said, it's looking more and more like we may have to make a run for it. And so at the crack of dawn, we woke our party, our observing party. In Colombia, we had 20 people. For this particular event, we had 80 people. So we had 2 busloads. As you can plainly see, the buses were a lot better, a lot more reliable than what we had in Colombia. And so we all got on board and started our trek from Lewistown. We traveled east. We were trying to stay ahead of a growing cloud cover coming in from the west. And we were on the road for pretty much about an hour, and soon it became apparent that we were going to have to stop and set up our equipment, all 80 of us, telescopes, binoculars, cameras, all sorts of paraphernalia. But where? Where could we set up? We finally found one spot. We saw a farmhouse located along Route 200. This is the route that we were traveling, and it had a huge field, perfect for viewing the eclipse. The question is, could we set up in this guy's field for viewing the eclipse? So I got off one bus, Glenn got off the other, and we trudged up to the farmhouse, knocked on the door, and when the door opened, I must tell you, the guy who opened the door, he looked like the doppelganger. He looked like the exact duplicate of the guy, the actor, Joseph Kearns, who played Mr. Wilson on the old TV show Dennis the Menace. If you remember that show back in the early 60s, it's on cable today. Anyway, he looked just like Mr. Wilson. And Glenn said to Mr. Wilson, the guy's name actually was Artie. He said, "Excuse me, sir." He said, "We're from New York," pointed to the 2 buses, "and we're here to observe the eclipse of the sun, which is going to happen in a very few minutes." He said, "We're wondering if we could use your field. Could we set up our equipment on your field?" The guy, big smile suddenly broke up on his face, and he said, you came all the way from New York to see the eclipse, and you want to use my field?" And he said, "Of course, go right ahead." He said, "All I got growing out there," he says, "be a different story in July and August, but right now all I've got growing out there is snow, grass, and sagebrush. Go ahead, go ahead." And so we both turned to the 2 buses. We both made thumbs up. You never saw 80 people come barreling out of 2 buses as quickly as they did, because the eclipse was about to begin. Set up equipment all over. And here we are, setting up our equipment and looking out, using our welder's glass. And there I am, big smile on my face. We had a nice clear view of the sun. And now what you're going to see and hear are snippets of our view of the eclipse, starting from just before totality and running through totality. You'll hear the excitement in our voices. You'll also hear in the background what sounds like a modulated tone. That was WWV. That's a shortwave time signal station, which would give us the exact times of when the eclipse was going to hit total, and times for the duration of the eclipse, which would be about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. But now you're going to see and hear snippets of Eclipse 1979, starting again just before the total phase of the eclipse.
It is getting spooky. It does look like a storm gathering now. Off to the west. Wait, come that way. There you see it? That's the umbra. There it is. That's the shadow. There it is. That's the shadow. Out there. See? It's coming. It's a thin crescent, about 98% now. I got a microphone here if you want it. Here we are. 1% before totality now. 1 minute before totality or less. Got it? Okay, okay. Unbelievable. Oh, this is unbelievable. Oh my God, I don't believe this. This is unreal. Look at this, Bailey's speed. We got Bailey's speed. Oh yeah, we got it. Oh, that's beautiful. Look at the glow in the sky. right. You can see that the shadow is elliptical shape. I forgot to start. Well, don't worry about it. Shit, I forgot to start mine.
Oh, look at the prominences. Anybody with binoculars, look at the prominences. They're absolutely fantastic. Look at the red all around. Look at the red. Oh, my God, look at the silhouette of the sky.
I don't believe this. This is unreal.
Isn't it beautiful?
Oh, this is something. I can't believe we're coming out of it now. We're beginning to come out of it. Oh, I got to see another one. This is unreal.
They're kind of big on. 4, 3, 2, 1. There goes the shadow. All right. Three cheers for the eclipse.
And indeed, it was an amazing sight. Of course, after the eclipse, everybody's jumping around, slapping each other on the back, hugging, kissing each other. I got carried around by a couple of the participants of our tour. We made it. It was a great, great view. And that night we had a celebratory dinner. Glenn and myself, we were so very, very happy that unlike Columbia 2 years earlier, this one was a fantastic success. One person who was not with us, and sadly he passed away just a few months ago, was Terence Dickinson, who was a well-known astronomer in Canada. Terry, and I knew him personally, Terry was very good at astrophotography, and he planned a very extensive astrophotography program to take pictures of the solar corona and of the sky and of the sun during the total phase of the eclipse. And just like Professor Young back in the 1800s, Terry came under the spell of totality. And when totality arrived, he said, I was totally unprepared for the awesome beauty and overwhelming power of a total eclipse. I was overwhelmed, incapable of performing even the most rudimentary tasks. I knew I was never be able to photograph the event. It was commanding me to use every second of viewing time to let my eyes soak up the image. So even though he had planned on photographing the eclipse, he wrenched his camera off of his telescope, quickly slipped in an eyepiece into the focuser, and gazed upon what was, in his opinion, the most stunning, awesomely beautiful astronomical image that he has ever seen. And that, my friends, will be available to all of you, weather conditions permitting, on April the 8th of next year. I would not see my next eclipse until 1990. And believe it or not, this is the least likely to try to observe. This eclipse would start in Helsinki, Finland, but then move over Siberia, cut across the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, and then end somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. In Sky and Telescope magazine, the comment was that eclipse would be elusive, with fog and low clouds being a major obstacle to those who tried to view it. The best bet would be to try to observe it from an aircraft. And in this particular map, you can see that most of the United States was out of the eclipse zone for viewing even a part of the eclipse, but the far west would get the last little bit of visibility of the eclipse as the sun was setting. And you see the various phases from various locations: Anchorage, Seattle, San Francisco, Billings. Basically, this was not an eclipse to try to see because of these circumstances. But looking at this map, my mind began to do a little bit of I started thinking in a strange way. I saw here's San Francisco, and here's Honolulu, and in between both of these cities was the track of the end of the track of the total eclipse. And I said to myself, I wonder, and that's always the important question, I wonder if there might be an aircraft, a commercial airline flight, traveling from San Francisco to Honolulu or from Honolulu to San Francisco that might possibly intercept the shadow of the moon over the Pacific Ocean. Now, at the time, 1990, there was no internet, Al Gore hadn't invented the internet yet. So what I had to do was, I was living on Long Island, New York at the time, Levittown, Long Island. I went to my local library and went to the reference section and got out of this, it almost looked like a Manhattan phone directory, the OAG, the official airline guide. And this book will tell you how to get from point A to point B, anywhere on the surface of the earth. If you wanted to go, let's say, from Omaha, Nebraska to Tokyo, Japan, this book will tell you all of the flights that would be leaving Omaha to get to Tokyo. And so the question was, would there be any flights near the eclipse track? Would there be a possibility of seeing the eclipse from a commercial airline? Soon enough, I found a flight. American Transair. This airline is not in business anymore. They are now defunct. But in 1990, I discovered that there was a flight that left Honolulu and traveled from Honolulu to San Francisco, flight 402, and that they would be near the eclipse track at the time the eclipse was reaching its peak. The only drawback is that it would be, the flight would have to be delayed by about 41 minutes. And, I had to approach the airline. I said, you have a chance to see this amazing spectacle, passengers on board. This will be like a bonus for them, but you have to delay the flight by about 41 minutes. And believe it or not, they thought it was a great idea, and they said, we'll do it. We will delay the flight on that particular day. They asked, are you going to be on that flight? I said, of course. I said, I may even bring a few friends with me. They said, fine, come on board. We'll do that. And here you see the three other people who were with me on that particular crazy adventure. On the right is Craig Small. Craig has seen now something like 30 plus eclipses. He's traveled all over the world, but his lucky charm is this flag. He had this flag made in the 1970s. This is his eclipse flag, and he takes it to every eclipse. And believe it or not, every eclipse that he has attended with the flag, he has seen without any problems with the weather. Behind the flag is another good friend of mine, Sam Storch. And over on the left is my wife, Renata. Believe it or not, Renata was 6 months pregnant when we went on this wacky escapade, and 6 months pregnant with our son, Joseph. I kid Joseph sometimes by telling him, this was your first eclipse. Your first total eclipse was this event. And Joseph would, of course, tell me, Dad, I don't remember seeing this eclipse. And I'd tell him, well, I forgot. You didn't have a womb with a view. Oh, anyway, flight 402, which on the message board said 320, the people who saw this didn't realize that we were going to purposely delay the flight by 41 minutes. And it was left up to me to make the announcement on board that flight to all the passengers, hey, we're delaying the flight, but there's good reason for that, because we're going to see a total eclipse of the sun. Interestingly, most of the passengers, not most, but a good number of them, really didn't have an interest in the eclipse. They'd rather watch the in-flight movie, which was, as you can see on the big screen over there, the in-flight movie was Driving Miss Daisy. And so they were more interested, a lot of them, in watching the movie as opposed to watching the eclipse. However, those who did see the eclipse either saw it from their own seat, the window seat, or those who didn't have access to a window stood up in the aisle and looked through the windows of those who had seats looking out toward the sun. And here's our captain, Captain Bob Leary. I mentioned Captain Bob because this was before 9/11. There's no way today that you would have access to going into the cockpit of an airline because of events that took place on that tragic day. But this is 1990, and I did have access. I knocked on the door and could go freely right into the cockpit. And it was a good thing that I went in right after we took off. I knew that we were going to intercept the shadow of the moon at 4:11 Greenwich Mean Time. And yet when I went into the cockpit to speak with Captain Leary, I noticed that on his dashboard, there were these numbers, 4:13, not 4:11. And I said to him, Captain Bob, what does 4:13 mean? And he said, oh, yeah, I was going to tell you about that. A Continental Airlines flight got in front of us at the last minute and set us back a couple of minutes. But we're going to get to that spot in the ocean, over the ocean, that you want to get to at 4:13, a couple of minutes later. That'll be all right, won't it? And he must have saw my face blanch, because when he told me that, I said, well, Captain Bob, we have to be there at 4:11. If we get there at 4:13, the shadow of the moon will have already moved off the surface of the earth. We'll miss the total phase of the eclipse. We won't be able to see totality. And Captain Bob looked at me and he said, so what you're saying is I have to make up 2 minutes? I said, yes, yes. Can you possibly do that? And he smiled. He said, oh, sure, no problem. He said, I can make up 2 minutes. I'm a good old boy. I can do that. And just as the eclipse was beginning, I saw the navigator, Frank Thomas, open up the door of the cockpit. He looked at me and he gave the thumbs up, saying we were back on track and that we were on track to see total eclipse at 4:11. Now, this is the one of the two videos I said I had a problem with, and yeah, so for whatever reason, I can't start this in PowerPoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going to do that. And let's see if I can, I'm going to try to, I'm going to try to advance. Let me just see if it is possible for me to do that. Let me see if I can get to this screen right here. Okay, that's good. That's good. So here's the film that we took, the video that Sam took from the aircraft. And as I said, this is what we saw as we moved toward totality. And you could hear in the background some of the people who were surrounding us looking out the window as we entered the total eclipse. And Sam was working two things. He was working his video camera with one hand on one shoulder, and in the other shoulder he had a pair of binoculars. So sometimes he's looking with the binoculars and the movie. Well, you'll see what I'm talking about here. Let's start this this audio and video. Here's where Sam tries to look through the binoculars and unfortunately moves the camera off of the corona for a few seconds.
Prominences visible naked eye at 12 o'clock, 8:30. Streamers at 12 and 6. There seems to be a gap in the corona at 4. All right, let's try and keep it in. Nothing visible in the stars and planets department.
Totality lasted 75 seconds, and we're coming to the end now.
Look how the light changes on the water. Here it comes.
And there it is. There was totality from the plane. We were very, very lucky to see that event. It still blows my mind that we were actually able to pull that off. It was an incredible sight. So now let me continue here with the presentation. And hang on for 1 second, one moment here. I'm going to stop the share. And okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen again. Give me a moment. I apologize for all of this. Unfortunately, this problem propped up literally just before the just before our show, and I'm doing the best I can here to. Okay, this is the view that I took from the plane with a 500 millimeter lens. You can see some of the prominences surrounding the darkened sun. And this was probably the best shot of all. This was taken by Craig Small with a wide angle lens. And you can actually see the shadow projected on the sky with the corona of the sun right smack in the middle during the middle portion of totality. Look how dark below, the cloud covered landscape below us. It's an amazing, amazing sight. The flight crew, Captain Leary, Frank Thomas, the flight attendants holding the Eclipse flag. I promised that they would get publicity out of this, and they certainly did, both in the New York Times and also in WeatherWise magazine. That's a trade magazine read by meteorologists all around the country. The following year, we had what was referred to as the big one, a total solar eclipse that was going to last almost 7 minutes. Almost as long as a total eclipse could last. That eclipse started across the Pacific, went across Mexico. You see where these two red stars are. That's where the eclipse would last for 7 minutes. However, I was not at the maximum point. I was over here, over Hawaii. And the reason I was in Hawaii was because I got the job of being the onboard meteorologist for an eclipse cruise that was put on by American Hawaii Cruises. Joe Rao, meteorologist, will position the SS Independence for the greatest possibility of seeing the spectacle. So once again, before the cruise, I got to visit the National Weather Service office to get the latest information on the weather prospects for the eclipse, standing with Renata and also with the meteorologist in charge, Hans Rosenthal. And a lot of people went to Hawaii because while the air travels off of the Pacific Ocean and hits the tall volcanic cones on the big island of Hawaii, forced upward, the moist air rises and produces clouds and also wet weather in the form of rain. But then the air is sloping down the other side of the mountain and is dried out by compression, and that produces clear skies. And because of the fact that the winds, the northeast trade winds blow at that time of the year, 95% of the time, there was a 95% chance that the weather would be good for the eclipse. So everybody on the big island would travel on the west side of the island where it was in the rain shadow and clear sky. The other side of the island, the dark side, would be where clouds and rain was expected. But two things happened that were unexpected. The first took place a month earlier. A giant volcanic eruption in the Philippines called Mount Pinatubo, which threw a tremendous cloud of ash and dust into space. That produced beautiful sunrises and sunsets, but it also meant that our beautiful tropical blue skies were going to be a lot hazier than what we would have liked them to see. The other thing that was unexpected was an unusual phenomenon called a TUT, a tropical upper tropospheric trough, and that produced clouds and widespread shower activity. So all the people who expected to have clear weather in Hawaii ended up looking at something like this. It's terrible. it was an out of season event. This is something that normally happens in early spring, not midsummer. And yet, here it was, cloud filled skies. And here I am, the guy who was supposedly going to move that ship out of the cloud cover, or at least try to. And indeed, on the morning of the eclipse, while it was drizzling on deck, Hans Rosenthal from Honolulu contacted me and said, you know, there's a nice opening in the clouds. You'll have to go about 30 or 40 miles to the southwest of where you're currently located. But if you go there, that may be your salvation. And it was. We had beautifully clear weather. And in fact, here you see my sister next to me, Lisa, as we're looking at another ship. This was the sister ship. We were on the Independence, and this was the Constitution that was coming to join us. There were so many people who signed on for the Eclipse cruise that when it sold out, there was a waiting list. And so Hawaii Cruises said, well, let's put them on another ship. And so the other ship followed our ship to this zone where the eclipse was going to be visible. Here you see people on board our ship looking at the sun through their respective filters. And there you see the view of totality, beautiful view. And look, right along the bottom there, you can see the cloud-filled skies that sadly sat over the big island of Hawaii and deprived all those people who went to Hawaii of seeing the total eclipse. And there's another view there of the solar corona, which was visible for us for 4 minutes during the darkest phase of the eclipse. We had celebrities on board. We had Frederick Pohl, a famous science fiction writer, to guide us in photographing the eclipse. We had George Keane, who got his picture on the cover of the 1979 edition, April 1979 edition of Life magazine. And he gave instructions on how people could best photograph the eclipse. But the one that I personally will always remember interacting with was Mike Collins. He was the command module pilot on Apollo 11. So while Armstrong and Aldrin cavorted on the surface of the moon, astronaut Collins was in the command module. They called him the forgotten astronaut, but let me tell you, he was a wonderful man. It was amazing to me. I had breakfast with him one morning, and I kept saying to myself, I kept trying to pinch myself. I said to myself, I'm talking to or having breakfast with one of the 3 astronauts who made the first journey to the moon in 1969. That was the highlight for me, along with the total eclipse in 1991. In 1998, another eclipse where I got a job as onboard meteorologist. This time, it would be in the Caribbean, a ship known as the Galaxy, Celebrity Cruises Galaxy. And on board that particular ship, we were off the coast of Montserrat, where they had an active volcano. It was most interesting to see that. That was in February of 1998. A few months earlier, though, I had the opportunity to tell my story about my grandfather and the promise he made of my first eclipse in Reader's Digest. I was in the November 1997 issue of Reader's Digest. Here's my story. And there were millions of people all over the world who read the article. And one of them in South Dakota wrote to me and had something that she wanted to give to me. She said, I remember that eclipse that your grandfather saw in 1925, and I've had something with me all of these years, and I think it's about time I parted company with it. I think you can put it to better use. And what was it? It was a solar eclipse filter that was made for the 1925 eclipse of the sun. And she gave it to me, or sent it to me. And so instead of using my solar filter or smoke or welder's glass to view the eclipse, I used that to honor my grandfather, who had passed away 5 years earlier, a tribute to him and how he got me started on solar eclipses. The eclipse was a spectacular sight. We were able to see 2 bright objects near the sun after the sun went into totality. This was Mercury up here and Jupiter down here. And we had an almost 4-minute total eclipse, another glorious, beautiful sight seen from shipboard. Glenn Schneider, my good friend, got in contact with a company in Dusseldorf, Germany in 2008. There was an eclipse that was going to be visible near the polar regions, near the North Pole in 2008. And this company, Polarflug, would fly up a few times each summer to give people a chance to see the North Pole. Glenn wrote a flight plan. He got quite adept at doing that. He wrote a flight plan for polar fluke and said, hey, how about seeing the total eclipse of the sun that's going to occur near the North Pole on August the 1st? They loved it. They loved that idea. And so Glenn got on board, and he also did some scientific research. He brought along his equipment, cameras, gyroscopes, and set it up in the cockpit for viewing the eclipse. Here you see him making last-minute adjustments, all set and ready to go. Where do I come in with this eclipse? The polar fluke people said to Glenn, we're going to get a lot of publicity here in Europe, but we'd love to have some publicity in the United States. You know somebody who might be able to give us some publicity in the U.S.? Glenn said, I sure do. I know somebody who could get you some publicity, my friend Joe Rao. And as it turned out, I was a member and still am a member of the Hayden Planetarium in New York. The American Museum of Natural History has a magazine called Natural History Magazine. And there you go. I went to the magazine and said, would you like me to write an article about flying up to the North Pole to see a total eclipse? They loved it. They said, that's great. And so I was able to get on board for free. They invited me on board this very special flight. Here's my boarding pass. Notice that the pass would take us to a fictitious point. And this was my window. They didn't give me a window seat with a big window. They said, you'll see the eclipse through that little circular window in the emergency hatch. Now, you may say to yourself, how much could you possibly see through something like that? Well, you could see a lot. Take a look at this picture that I took of the eclipse through that little circular 3-inch hole. After the eclipse was over, we took the perfunctory picture in front of the plane. Here I is giving a thumbs up for that. Glorious, glorious flight. Glenn was very successful. He took some great pictures for his scientific research, but also I was able to take pictures and write an article for Natural History. Here is my article, which actually, and I still don't know to who this day, who suggested it, but I was nominated and won from the Solar Physics Division of the American Astronomical Society, the Popular Science Award for my article, Shades of Glory, which appeared in Natural History magazine. In 2016, another eclipse, this one moving, everybody went to Indonesia. But this time I looked at the path and I said, you know, the eclipse is going to take place somewhere between Hawaii and Alaska. And this time I contacted Alaska Air. This time the flight would have to be delayed 30 minutes, not 41 minutes, but Alaska Air thought about it and said, yeah, this sounds like a great event. Glenn once again wrote up the flight plan, passed it along to the people at Alaska Airlines, and they looked at it and they said, this seems perfectly logical to do. They made a big deal about it. Alaska Airlines promoted it very heavily in the news media, showing how they were going to intercept the eclipse track from a flight that normally flies out of Anchorage to Honolulu. Here is our captain, Captain Hal Anderson. We had dinner the night before, and he was talking to all of us and telling us about what he had planned to do following Glenn's flight plan. Once again, Craig was there with his eclipse flag, and here are some of the people, some of my eclipse chasing buddies, along with my wife Renata, who were on board that flight. Here I am showing some last-minute data to Captain Anderson, and I did a report about this event for my TV station at the time, News 12. And here's what people saw on News 12 about that eclipse.
Now to a News 12 special report. Not many people get the chance to see a solar eclipse from the air, but our chief meteorologist convinced a major airline to alter the path of one of its regularly scheduled flights to give passengers and crew a chance to experience an incredible celestial sight. Here's Joe Rao's remarkable story, Into the Eclipse.
Oh my God, look at it. Here comes a shadow. Look at that. It's like a tornado. Oh my God, here we go.
Exclamations of wonder from a person witnessing a sight that few people in their lifetime ever get a chance to see. This is the shadow of the moon streaking silently over the Pacific Ocean at 7,000 miles per hour, about to rendezvous with a commercial jet aircraft just prior to the start of the most awe-inspiring sight the heavens can offer, a total eclipse of the sun.
Totality! Totality!
But it was the circumstances of how this flight came about that garnered national attention.
We are about to embark on a trip that a lot of people are calling historic here. Now, a second ago, I spoke to the man who actually did this whole process. A year ago, Joe Rao noticed that this path of the eclipse was going to cross between Hawaii and Alaska, and he contacted Alaska Air to make this special flight happen.
And that's how, in the dead of winter, I found myself heading to Ted Stevens International Airport in beautiful Anchorage, Alaska, on a day where the Alaskan mountains sparkled and plane tickets promised Hawaii. Waiting for me at the gate was Captain Hal Anderson of Alaska Airlines, who was going to pilot our journey into darkness.
It's a rare privilege to see a total eclipse, particularly from 37,000 feet.
I think Alaska Airlines should be congratulated because most other airlines just give you an in-flight movie. We're going to go one better than that, much better than that. We're going to give you a chance to see something you may never see again, a total solar eclipse. That's the promise I made to all the passengers as we boarded a PAX 737 jet en route to Honolulu, where the in-flight entertainment began with a pair of Eclipse safety glasses. And soon, everyone on board began to get into place for the big show in the sky. The dark silhouette of the moon was about to begin crossing directly in front of the disk of the sun. First, just a small bite cutting into the bottom of the sun. And as the minutes ticked off, that bite became progressively larger, and larger, and larger still, cutting the sun down to a narrow crescent. In the final moments before totality, just like curtain time before a Broadway play, the light rapidly dimmed. Then, 700 miles north of Honolulu, the main event. Sun, moon, plane, perfectly aligning for a perfect moment. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. Once in a lifetime. Time just stopped. The eclipse was frozen above us, like a phenomenal photograph pasted on the dome of the sky. The incredible corona, the crown of the sun, was now in full view. Study of this solar atmosphere is one of the main scientific benefits from an eclipse. More is being learned about the corona all the time. Some believe it may have an effect on the Earth's weather. But time was not standing still. After just 113 seconds, the moon's movement brought forth a second sunrise, ending the late afternoon darkness that had stretched across the horizon. And the passengers were still in awe.
You could see that thing coming at you, both sides of it, like a blanket being thrown toward your face.
I have never seen one before, and it was spectacular, especially when the moon was totally over the sun.
Spectacular and eerie at the same time. Most on board soon came to realize that for them, such an amazing sight may never come again, proving that age-old saying is true. Why worry about your destination when the journey looks like this? Joe Rao, News 12, airborne above the North Pacific.
Indeed, it turned out to be very good. And not only was the eclipse such a success for Alaska Airlines, they actually asked us to come back for the Great American Eclipse that happened in 2017 that went across the country. And you can see there, Glenn wrote the flight plan for that as well. And we had a fantastic view of that eclipse. You could see my giving a news conference for a galaxy of people all over for that event. Once again, we had Captain Anderson on board, and he gave us a fantastic view of totality. And here you see the view that I had through the airline window of Solar Eclipse 17. And now, once again, we are all awaiting this event coming up in 2024. So those of you who are looking forward to this, I know that a lot of you are. this is going to be an amazing sight, one that I think you are all so lucky to live in the totality path. And believe me, I will tell you right now, when you see this, and if it's in a clear sky especially, you'll never forget it. And the first words out of your mouth after this eclipse will probably be, when can I see another one? And the next one after 2024 in the United States won't be until the year 2044. So you'll have 20 years to wait unless you decide to do some traveling to other parts of the world to see the total eclipse of the sun. So I know I went a little overboard, and I'm sorry about the technical glitch in the middle, but I hope that a lot of you found this interesting and enjoyable. And if you have any questions about the upcoming eclipse or eclipses in general, right now, I'll be very happy if you want to unmute yourself and answer your questions.
Joe, thank you. That was an awesome presentation. We had 2 questions in the chat. The first one was from Deb. Was there a total eclipse here in the 1980s?
No, there was not in Irondequoit or in New York State. The last time New York State played host to a total eclipse of the sun was the one that my grandfather saw in 1925. Now, there was an annular or ring of fire eclipse that did occur over upstate New York in May of 1994. It wasn't a total eclipse, but it was one where the sun was, when the moon was a little too small to cover the sun completely. It was kind of like putting a penny on top of a nickel. And the result was a ring of sunlight that shone around the darkened moon during that eclipse. So maybe that's the one that you might have remembered. But this is going to be the first total eclipse that's going to come to New York State since the one in 1925, 99 years ago.
Okay, thank you. The second blurb in the chat is actually a story from Dale. She says, my husband and I are eclipse chasers. First one was the 7th of March in 1970. We drove to Virginia Beach from Rochester, New York. It was awesome. We tried to see the February 26, 1979 eclipse when we lived in California. Drove to the highest point around Mount Diablo, camping out to try to get above the clouds, but they came right over the mountain and we saw nothing. On August 21st, 2017, we went to Lake Murray, South Carolina, and saw the perfect eclipse. Can't wait for next year's eclipse.
Well,
thank you, Dale. That's a great story.
Well, I've been to 13 eclipses. I've been clouded out of 2, the one in Colombia and the one in Antarctica. Yeah, and I wish you well for next year. I see from Kevin, he said, can I recommend an airline portable telescope for eclipse chasing? You might want to go and check out the Edmund Astroscan. There's a company in Barrington, New Jersey called Edmund Scientific, and they have a telescope. It is very portable, and yes, you can probably put it in the luggage baggage rack above your head. It costs a few $100s, about $300, but it's the Edmund Astroscan telescope, and again, put out by Edmund in Barrington, New Jersey.
Great, thank you.
Deb Moritor, I hope I pronounced that correctly, said, what was the event a couple of years ago? I went to Central Library. There was an eclipse in June of 2021, which was a partial eclipse, and it occurred at sunrise, and it was 80% coverage. So you would have seen a substantial amount of the sun coming up above the horizon already covered by the moon, but it was a partial eclipse. Still a very interesting sight, and one that a lot of people saw and remembered with some fondness, but again, nothing, I assure you, nothing compared to the event that's coming our way in 8 months on April the 8th.
Any other questions that Joe can answer for you?
Well, if there's no other questions, again, I want to thank all of you. I want to apologize for the glitch in trying to show some of the video before. That kind of set us back about 5 or 10 minutes, but
the workaround was perfect.
I want to stress again, cross your fingers, please hope for clear weather, because again, this is something that well, having seen it many times before, when it is cloudy, you feel very sad. Even when it's cloudy, if you've never seen one of these before, the sight of the sky just darkening very rapidly, even more so than an approaching severe thunderstorm, is an amazing sight to see. But to see it actually in a clear sky, that's something to see. To see the diamond ring effect, to see the stars and planets come out in the middle of the day, and to see a beautiful saffron and pinkish orange coloration around the horizon during totality. All of these things will be evident to you during the upcoming eclipse. And again, I just hope that all of us have this opportunity to enjoy, to see it, because it is going to be a very, very special and magnificent event. Like I said, it's more than just actually seeing it. It's an experience. As I said, every fiber of you gets involved during those precious moments during the total phase of the eclipse. And it's just amazing. And again, hopefully it will be visible to all of us. And I wish all of you well, all of you luck on seeing this event. Again, Monday, April the 8th, 2024, darkness will come to Irondequoit and also to Rochester, New York, 3:20 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Totality will last 3 minutes, 40 seconds. Savor every second. It is going to be just great. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate all the information you shared. That was a fascinating program. And thank you, everyone, for logging in and joining us via Zoom. It's been a great night.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. And maybe we'll all get together after the eclipse and share stories.
That would be awesome. Yes, please.
Have a good one. Have a very, very good evening.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.